Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Managing Incidents Wisely, the Need for a Closed-Loop, Risk-Based Approach, sponsored by ETQ. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speakers and their organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorse them. At the end of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. You can feel free to ask your question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but due to the large number of participants, we may not get to all of the questions to answer them live on our webcast. However, all unanswered questions will be forwarded on to today's speakers. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll go over a little bit more about that after the presentation concludes. This webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just return to this URL to view the archived webcast. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to begin. We have 2 speakers today. TJ Filipino leads the Environmental, Health, and Safety Services in the Southeast for AECOM, where he currently focuses efforts in the high-tech, telecom, and data center sectors. And Bowtie Model is an EHS specialist at ETQ and is responsible for attending client workshops and proof of concepts. Bowtie?
Thank you very much, Kyle, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Before we get started and we actually jump into the presentation, I'd just briefly like to go over our agenda for today and just some high-level goals that we hope to accomplish. So the first of which we're going to talk about some of the goals that we have for today's presentation. We're going to touch upon some basic concepts in risk so that we have a baseline for our discussion moving forward. Next, we'll touch upon some high-level challenges that we find in environmental health and safety with an emphasis on risk. And we'll start identifying some of those risks and the findings associated to that. And lastly, we'll touch upon the meat and potatoes of really this presentation today, which is what is closed-loop incident management and how can we help to achieve that utilizing some risk measures. And one of the last topics that we'll discuss is really the new standard, the new ISO 2015 standard, and what it really means for environmental health and safety, specifically with an emphasis on risk. And lastly, some questions. So please do, as Kyle mentioned, throughout the course of this presentation, type in your questions and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. So without much further ado, I'd like to pass it to my colleague TJ, who will be going over the beginning portion of this presentation. TJ?
Thank you, Bowtie, and thank you very much, Kyle. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome to everybody for joining this particular webinar regarding risk and risk management. So one of the key objectives we want to address is how enterprises understand and comprehend challenges incorporating risk and risk discussions. We're looking for ways to identify risk in the workplace and how to incorporate those incident management, incident review, and incident investigation practices to make better decisions. And lastly, as Bowtie discussed, we're looking ahead to ISO 45001, that integration of the former ISO OSAS standard, the former OSAS 14001 standard, and looking ahead to see how that particular process will integrate new concepts within safety management systems at an international level. So one of the most important aspects we wanted to discuss was development of a holistic risk practice. And I think in the past we've come across this challenge on many locations. And if you're looking across the board, whether it's state, region, country specific, one of the key features is identifying common definitions with an understanding of risk and risk management. As we look back over time, we've noted that initially identification of risk or the opportunity to assign risk to a specific task was part of a typical audit or maybe even an observation program. And over time, we've developed new tools such as real-time data capture and opportunities to comprehend risk in the field with the workforce and with work teams to help drive incident identification and better collaboration through risk review and risk evaluation. The basics associated with risk management, excuse me, understanding what presents a hazard to the workforce, whether it's an event, whether it's a cause or a situation, and understanding how we prevent those hazards from occurring in the workplace, hence the term risk. The effort that we typically assign to that is the control, how we get into the control. And before we get too deep, we want to make sure we understand through the cartoon presented exactly where risk is assigned. And I'm sure many of you have seen similar situations, maybe not as comical as this one, where risk is associated with a field verification or a field observation. And I think it's important to note that, yes, we of course want to identify how to mitigate the risk, but we also want to mitigate the hazard as well. We're looking for a holistic approach to mitigating both. So it would be unfortunate if we omitted the risk and covered the tripwire with the board, but yet left the hazard sitting for a potential future failure. So the opportunity exists here within the hierarchy of control to mitigate both the risk and the hazard through elimination of the hazard and mitigation of the risk. And I think Cody will discuss a few more terms later on in this presentation with regards to risk management and risk assessment we get further in. Moving on to slide 6, when we discuss risk management, we're not just talking about one area of business. I'm sure many of you have come across risk, whether it's in brand management, whether it's in cost reduction, whether it's in promoting morale. We've all seen opportunities to mitigate risk as we look to do our jobs on a daily basis. So we want to look at risk holistically across the board. And as we get further into the presentation here, we're going to touch on 2 key topics. And those are the metrics used to prepare and assess risk, both leading and lagging indicators. And we'll touch on those in a few moments. Common risk tools. Often you'll find in the field decision trees, risk matrices, risk surveys, and Bowtie models common within high hazard industries used to support risk mitigation methods. We understand that using these risk mitigation methods is twofold. 1, data in. 2, understanding and performing an appropriate risk analysis. And we hope to use the tools available to us to, 1, collect appropriate data, and 2, use that data in a risk analysis model to end up with an appropriate root cause. It would be unfortunate to look at leading or lagging indicators in context of specific opportunities within addressing risk and not note that leading and lagging indicators have limitations associated with their use in any risk model. Moving on to identifying risks and EHS controls. Most of you are familiar with the elements of risk control, how we mitigate them, how we plan for emergencies, how we measure them. And I would offer that there's an opportunity to improve each and every step along those lines in terms of risk control by understanding the information collected and using appropriate metrics to not only collect it, but parse that data and then use appropriate risk tools to mitigate the effect. At the end of the day, the goal is to end up with a workplace that is safer the day after than it was the day before. All workers going home in the same way they came to the job site. Some extra tools in terms of developing risk analysis. I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with the JSA, the job safety analysis, or in many cases, the job hazard analysis. We use these tools on a daily basis to identify how our workforce perceives risks and addresses those hazards by developing either specific workplace controls to mitigate the hazard or eliminating the hazard using appropriate hierarchy of controls. We want to reflect back to what we saw on slide 5, and we want to think about that anvil and wire. The appropriate approach is, again, a holistic methodology where we're addressing the risk and the hazard. And I think from going through this process, we have the opportunity to look at certain key scenarios, whether it's a zero incident program, a risk survey, or a behavior-based safety program, to develop and prepare for appropriate risk mitigation processes through a risk analysis program or a corrective action program. The corrective action program, though not mentioned here, at the end of the day, is probably the most effective tool for us in terms of assessing the effectiveness of our ability to identify and resolve corrective actions. Looking at it from a leading indicator perspective, we don't want to use metrics such as incident to dictate whether or not we are effective. We, of course, want that information to support whether or not we have prepared our risk mitigation appropriately, but it should not be predictive in that manner. The concept of zero incident safety culture and behavior-based safety. So from a risk perspective, the holistic approach would be to, quote, changing the hearts and minds where every accident is preventable. And I'm sure there are many of you out there that have seen this concept and are probably scratching their heads and saying, yes, we've seen it, and no, we don't agree because statistically that may not be possible. And reflecting on that concept in terms of Heinrich's law, we have to take a look at whether or not we can achieve this type of program, whether or not it can be achieved, not whether or not it is achievable. And from our understanding, one of the most important aspects of developing a zero incident culture such as this is accepting the principle that one, every incident is preventable, and two, the way to prevent every incident is to communicate the risks and hazards. And to do that, we of course need to collect appropriate information, and then reflecting back to the tools that Bowtie will discuss shortly, we must use that information in a manner such that it affects change, not only in the culture of our workforce, but their training, their procedures, the design of the facility. We don't want to look at it from a myopic perspective, whereas at the end of the day, we've used this information to potentially revise a PPE procedure or potentially revise a workplace procedure in terms of our understanding of risk. What we want to do is touch on every point. If we can effectively remove the process that installed the anvil at the beginning on slide 5, then I think we've done our duty in terms of understanding and mitigating risk. And that takes us to that concept of root cause. The purpose of the risk assessment process is to definitively understand the root cause and drive that root cause back through the organization, back through the culture, and back through the processes to prevent that incident or injury from happening in the future. Moving on to slide 11. Utilizing the tools at hand, we look to identify risk through our incident management process. And I think the most important component to that is the collection of data. We discuss how we collect data through field observations, through audits, through training completion rates. And it's important to note that all of that information becomes part of a corrective action program. We want to make sure that as we accept that information into our systems, we are using that data from a leading indicator perspective to create work programs that reflect back a higher degree of safety than we originally had. Couple that leading indicator program with what you would find in terms of a lagging indicator program where we identified accidents. We have the opportunity to then focus our leading indicator structure against what we would consider high hazard or high risk work activities or processes that have, from an EHS perspective, the opportunity to improve safety at the most rapid pace possible. Of course, we are shooting for zero. Of course, we are attempting to eliminate all injuries. But we all know in a practical world, using lagging indicators to identify severity, to identify hazard, to identify risk, will serve to help refine that information collected on the leading indicator side. And I think, from my perspective, reflecting that information into the corrective action program and targeting by risk, by severity, those key features will initially start the ball rolling in terms of changing the culture or changing the understanding of safety behaviors in the workplace. And the use of real-time data serves as an opportunity to drive that home on a daily basis. Real-time live data has proven to be able to effectively capture and show on a moment's notice how we should be working together to correct safety behaviors. And it's not the EHS person, it is not the frontline supervisor, it is the actual worker in the field driving that on a daily basis. The greater the number of the observations, the more impactful the data, the more likely we are to change those hearts and minds and improve the situation moving forward. Moving on to slide 12, and I'll be passing this off to Bowtie here in another slide. The intent here is to identify how to mitigate undesired events. And the use of data to collect information, both lagging and leading, is critical to developing an appropriate hazard analysis system. And I look forward to hearing more from Bowtie in terms of how we can better collect data, filter it through a root cause system, a risk analysis system, and use that information to effectively change our procedures, policies, and cultures moving forward. Bowtie, at this point, I would pass off to you in terms of understanding and a better assessment of the risk tools. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ, and thank you, everyone. Just picking up where TJ left off, I think there were a lot of important things that he actually mentioned. And the first of which is establishing those controls for a proper, a safe environment, and really a culture change. It's really a paradigm shift in a lot of the organizations and customers and clients that I speak with on a daily basis, because the safety programs, they really resonate, I guess, with your boot to ground type of personnel, but it's much more difficult passing safety off as a culture change within an organization. And hopefully throughout the remainder of the discussion, we can help to illuminate some of the challenges that some of our customers do face on a day-to-day basis. But absolutely, as TJ was mentioning, the corrective action process is really key in really identifying a lot of these, incident-related items and really driving the root cause and really, driving the full investigation. But one of the important things that it really helps facilitate in is in continuous improvement. The corrective action process really does benefit us in kind of keeping that closed loop incident process. So not only have we gone through our plan, do, act, check typical process, but we're able to continuously improve upon what we do on a day-to-day basis, especially in regards to safety in our organization. So one of the tools I'd like to discuss is probably a tool that you didn't even know was risk-related, but that is this concept of a decision tree. So, as I mentioned, it's a lot of people don't really put two and two together when it comes to risk assessments really relating to decision trees, but decision trees are, in fact, risk assessments. And you're given an input, or what may be an adverse event, and you have the ability to use the decision tree to help you determine the outcome of that event. So you can build it in such a way that it will help you come to the right decision and prove guidance on that decision. So this is really an effective way of performing a risk assessment, especially since it allows the users to follow a specific path or a specific flow of logic. So if something happens, then something else happens. and there's a full traceability, and it's a really good visual representation of all of the associated inputs that really drive the result of this. So decision trees are really powerful in that they can be embedded directly into the operational process. So without having, any sort of diagram or complex mathematical context, like maybe one of the next risk-related items we'll talk about, a risk matrix, you can really build them directly into a system as part of your process. So this is especially good when assessing the impact of a process change, maybe in the context of change management that you do within your organization, or maybe determining whether or not you need to report something to a regulatory agency. I really see my customers utilizing that aspect of it more and more, whether or not an incident is actually reportable to the FDA. Obviously, we don't want to go ahead and submit a bunch of frivolous cases, but based on the regulations, we have very clear guidelines on what and what is not reportable. So I really see decision trees as a highly useful tool in actually getting to the bottom of whether or not we need to report these specific items, or if they can be lagging indicators in our whole risk-averse culture that we're hoping to build within our organization, and really determining whether or not we need a corrective action. So it's really easy to use decision trees. They're used in everyday environments, and they really assist in the incident closed loop process that we're really driving at today. Okay, and this is the example of the decision tree as mentioned. Next item I'd like to discuss is this concept of a risk matrix. So this is perhaps one of the most common risk tools that are utilized, and this is what we would regard as a risk matrix. It's a basic grid. It's quick. It's easy to use. Typically color coordinated, designed to make risk level evident to all people in a given operation. So what risk matrices really do are they plot maybe 2 or sometimes 3 levels of severity or of risk, and really you can use it to drive a basic calculation, or what we would call, what I typically tend to hear a lot is risk thresholds. So based on a specific calculation or a combination of the outcomes based on our assessment, we can really kind of drive what our risk level is going to be on any specific given item. So, a lot of the times this type of a tool can be utilized in that more predictive type of analysis in regards to risk. But typically, a lot of the times we don't have the ability to really utilize that type of information to mitigate these hazards, as TJ was mentioning earlier. So initially, anytime we're building a good safety program, typically we'd be using a risk matrix after the fact, unfortunately, whether it be an incident or a corrective action. How does it affect us operationally? How does it affect us from a occupational perspective, from a health perspective? I see all types and levels of these risk matrices that are built out, and they're really quite useful to define. They help us define what our risk levels are within our organization, and really sets up the controls in place on how we want to deal with any given risk, depending on where it may fall. However, it's really important to vet, your risk matrix, and to do, continuous reviews of your analysis. Although sometimes you may get results that are mathematically sound, they may not always fit into the context of your operation. So it is something that needs to be in tune with what you're doing on an organizational and an operational level. So what I tend to do with any type of a customer that I interface with is that we would vet that together utilizing some real-world examples. So what do you actually do within your organization? and really kind of do a basic applicability exercise to see, how does this still fit into what we do within our organization. Okay. Moving forward to the next risk-related item that I'd like to discuss today, and this is really the concept of a risk survey. So sometimes you'll hear surveys, sometimes you'll talk about, you'll hear BBS or behavioral-based surveys or behavioral-based observations. But really what this is when we're talking about Heinrich's Law, and I don't know if a lot of our viewers today are familiar with that, the pyramid, the incident-related pyramid, where we have really low-level occurrences, maybe some leading indicators, some lagging indicators, and then some high-level occurrences, and then at the very top you have your catastrophic occurrence. Really building that pyramid out, or that risk or safety-related structure within our organization, the risk surveys or the BVS or BVOs that you see really are the platform for that type of a safety program that you're building. And really, this is really promoting a safe and a safety and risk culture within your organization. So a lot of times what I've even seen is that some of our clients will actually do incentivized-based program. TJ, I don't know if you're familiar with this or if you've seen this, but what we see is that based on a certain number of risk-related observations or safety observations that are done, maybe they would give an extra day of a PTO or something nice in regards to the observee or who's actually doing the observation. But what it does is it actually starts, with some initial probing, it actually starts to change the mindset and the hearts and minds. Really, getting back to TJ's comment earlier, it really starts moving and changing our perspectives on how we need to operate, and really how accountable we are as colleagues and as employees within an organization for each other. And if we see something unsafe, if we see a leak, if we see some spill on the floor, really taking the onus upon ourselves to kind of call out that type of a behavior and really driving, our risk and those lagging indicators to really build upon some good predictive data, pushing forward, and really building out that risk and that safety program that we keep mentioning. So sometimes we'll see it on a survey basis, where surveys are kicked out on a week basis or on a month basis, and sometimes we see the ad hoc related types of submittals where it's just a basic observation. We see something, we say something. So really, really beneficial tool for us. The next risk-related item moving forward is something that I like to discuss. It's called Bowtie analysis. So in my experience, and luckily being a solution engineer and being an EH&S specialist, I get the opportunity to work with a lot of different customers and a lot of different clients. And really where we see the Bowtie related model in a lot of examples, sometimes I see it related in our energy, some of our energy related clients where you really have at the center of this, you see an undesired event, that catastrophic event that we're looking to mitigate. But predominantly where we see this type of model applied is within the aviation or in the safety, the SMS type of industry, where obviously our catastrophic events are something undesirable happening to the aircraft or something of that nature. But what we see is that a lot of these models actually get adopted by some of these different industries. So when we're talking specifically in regards to Bowtie, you may ask yourself, well, we don't have that many critical events, so we really don't have like a high history of risk within our organization. So Bowtie really is a great method for assessing of those of risk of those low occurrence types of events. So if you don't have critical events that are happening on a day-to-day basis, you might want to utilize this Bowtie-related model because it really is for low-frequency related critical events that are occurring. So in some cases, you may have very little data on potential critical events, but the undesired effect of these events are so catastrophic that you cannot afford to sit back and just wait for it to happen. So unlike some of the previous tools, Bowtie is really considered a proactive risk assessment tool in that it looks to mitigate some of that risk before it even happens. So this model really looks at the undesired effect, which is usually something bad like loss of life, and really builds out controls as barriers to prevent that event from occurring. So if you look at the diagram here, you see that we have threats, we have consequences on the other side of the bow tie, and then we have preventative controls and recovery controls that are in place. And this goes to tie back to our baseline that TJ touched upon earlier, which is really, the proper documentation, the procedures that we have in place within our organization, and of course, most importantly, our employees that are properly trained on the procedures and those controls that we have in place. So essentially how it works in a nutshell is you have an undesired event in the center, you analyze initially the impact of that event, and you're effectively, in that case, building out a scenario in which that event might occur and putting preventive controls in place to mitigate the risk of it actually occurring. So similarly, you want to build out recovery controls to minimize the risk of impact, God forbid, if that does happen in that example. So, bow tie is really specific for aviation. Sometimes I see it in energy. You may hear something similar in regards to HACCP, or hazard analysis and critical control points, which is a similar type of tool for the food and beverage industry, where you go through the whole process of creating a specific product, and at every step of the process, you really follow your HARP-C related model, and you can really analyze and assess controls for any potential hazard that occurs. So what we tend to see is that a lot of these different industries will adopt the different risk-related measures. So the next item that I'd like to talk to is really touching and tying this all back into the closed-loop incident management process. So when we talk about some of those risk-related measures, you can really see how the closed loop or the continuous loop of specific tasks or actions within an organization is driven. So initially, some undesired event will occur, and an investigation is done. And really that goes back to getting at the root cause of what we're after. Then we want to verify the effectiveness of that. It's probably going to be driven by a corrective action-related process that will probably have one of the risk-related models that I mentioned above integrated. So now that we're doing a corrective action, really we can assess now what's that level of risk. And really that's at the analysis and closure portion. Once we do our initial containment of whatever that undesired event may have been, now we can start assessing and grading that based upon some of the risk measures that we just discussed, and we can continue to monitor that for any type of future reoccurrence. So just to recap that, again, it's really driven upon a model of continuous improvement. So we see in a number of different industries, whether it be product and process related, we talked about the JSAs, we talked about HACCP briefly, change management. From the manufacturing and really production related types of industries, you see non-conforming types of reports, planned deviations, really that event management that we're discussing, and your incident and accident related reporting. And then when we talk about post-production, we're talking about really some of these processes that drive this continuous improvement, again, going back to our employee or our customer-related complaints, any type of supplier-related ratings, internal audits, and again, back to corrective action, which really drive a lot of these continuous improvement-related processes. Okay? So again, I briefly touched upon it before, but we talk about plan, do, check, act, and we talk about how this really is our closed loop. So initially, we want to plan. We want to do some related calendar development. We want to make sure that we have everyone on the same page when we're actually assessing the risk or the undesired event that comes in, based on that incident. And as well in the planning aspect, we also want to bring back our controls. We want to do a basic assessment on the procedures that were in place. Really take a look at them and see if there was anything that maybe could have been done from a control perspective that could have helped mitigate this risk-related item or incident. The do, really again that's driven, and do and check is more of the corrective action-related process, where we are actually going through the process of investigating the root cause. We're getting our findings. We are assessing those values. We're assigning specific risk-related items to them. We may be monitoring a specific item if we had graded it as a low-risk item. So again, we realize, and really this is an important matter, is that a lot of our environmental health and safety, or maybe even our quality-related departments, are they tend to be maybe potentially understaffed, at least from the customers that I work with. But we do realize that resources are limited in a complex working environment. So when we talk about monitoring for future occurrences, and when I actually step into the next slide that I discussed, which is lagging and leading indicators, risk really drives that resource allocation, and really, as long as we have the proper risk-related controls in place, and we know how we're going to act based upon a specific assessment of risk, we can just monitor specific things. So if they're low occurrence or low risk, low severity related types of items that we've assessed, maybe we don't want to waste our time and resources blowing a full corrective action. Maybe we want to see and monitor for any types of future occurrences. Now, if we're having high frequency of low severity related items, then maybe indeed, certainly we're going to have to do a corrective action and really get to the root cause of these types of items. But we do realize that may not always be the case, and we want to take that on a case-by-case basis. So, really moving forward, as I had mentioned, when we're talking about lagging and leading indicators, what I like to call this is really the rear view mirror, or taking a look at, how can we start creating meaningful data within our organization to be more predictive, especially in regards to safety. So as I previously mentioned on the previous slide, when we're talking about these low severity related items, risk-related items, these are really the lagging indicators that drive us, or that really build some of that base data out in our model, so that we can do some trend analysis. We can have some valuable metrics to really grade where we are in regards to assessing that type of risk and really mitigating that hazard. Whereas lead indicators typically will be things that we can predictively see in the future, or maybe some high-level risk-related items that we can use as our basis for that data model, where we know in the future we definitely cannot have this type of hazard or this type of an incident occur again. So really, when we're looking at the rear view mirror, it's important to have both types of data to really build out that level of reporting and that level of metrics that we really need. And as we touched upon, at the beginning of the slide when we went over our agenda, the interesting thing that we tend to see is that risk now really is really pervasive. So we see it really penetrating the quality related. So the ISO 9001:2015 standard that just actually was, I think it's going, or it's actually already in effect. Excuse me. But it's such risk analysis is actually incorporated to better identify high risk related events. Whereas, as TJ had mentioned earlier, for one of the OSHAS related regulations, which is the ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety, which is, I believe, going to be live next year in October, and they're drafting and going through the review phase now. But what I always found interesting about these is that really the regulations tend to drive each other, and at least that's what I've seen in my experience, is that they tend to beg, borrow, and steal from each other. Whereas risk now is becoming more important for organizations, and it's become a focus in 9001. It's also becoming pervasive and will be most certainly included in what we have in 45001 moving forward. And really, what does it mean for us in environmental health and safety when we talk about it? And really, it's being built out to include risk in a much more broader meaning. So when we talk about the quality management process, it's also been adopted in environmental health and safety, or HES, or whatever the acronym you may tend to use within your organization. We know that mitigating activities associated to specific type of risk is explicitly stated in the new regs. So when we're capitalizing on opportunities, we want the value of accepting or foregoing, or maybe even doing some cost-related analysis, which tends to drive decisions sometimes, especially for low severity related risk items. If the cost is too high to investigate, it may be something we want to forego moving forward. And lastly, some of the other points that I wanted to touch upon is the new standard really addresses some of the individual standards. So not only 45001, but I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with 14001, which is a spec specifically for handling environmental hazards before, during, and after their creation. So the newest revision really puts a higher emphasis on risk and examining system-wide risks and concerns. So not only is risk becoming really a must in incidents and really how we handle our closed-loop related incident management process, but it's really becoming pervasive in terms of what we see in the regulations, and really driving through to some of the broader regulations like the 14001 and the 45001. So that is essentially what we have for you guys today. I thank you all for the opportunity. And I think, Kyle, maybe we'll take this opportunity to answer some questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both for your presentation. Before we dive into the Q&A, I wanted to remind everyone of the evaluation survey I mentioned at the top of the hour. The survey should be appearing on your screen now, and we ask that you consider completing it to let us know your thoughts. Your input that you give on this survey goes to directly improving future webcasts. So I hope you take the time to fill out the survey. If you don't see the evaluation survey on your screen, turn off your pop-up blockers. And yes, let's dive into some of the questions. Consider financial impacts associated with incidents and business success, things like embedded costs associated with lost time, lost revenue, medical care, and so forth. Have you observed other financial impacts resulting from increased incident rates?
And TJ, I can take this one if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So certainly what we tend to see is another big financial impact that I tend to see, at least, and it does drive a lot of our relationships with some of our customers. Really is getting actually dinged by, whether it be the FDA or some of the OSHA related organizations. So when they come and they do an internal audit, there are plenty of things that an auditor is looking for, depending upon how you do your reporting, how you report specific items to OSHA, and we certainly see that being a big financial impact and really a driver. TJ, did you have any other ones that you could think of potentially?
I think for me, one of the most important is impact to brand. We are finding more and more sensitivity from leadership towards how their brand is perceived in the workplace and also in the general public's eyes. So having an effective incident mitigation and control program certainly helps drive down those incident reporting numbers and helps drive what folks see outwardly as not only a successful business, but one that cares about the people, cares about the environment, and it cares about the workers that are associated with it.
Great. Thank you both. Has leadership supported accident prevention programs through combined evaluation of lagging and leading indicators? If so, what aspects of this approach contribute to a reduction in accidents? And if not, which indicator is preferred?
I can take that one if that's okay, Bowtie.
Absolutely.
Sure. So what we found over time is pulling together data specifically on just a leading or only a lagging indicator. We recognize that an inability to capture what would be effectively an opportunity to identify where in the work cycle the injury occurred. So if you're focusing on collecting lagging indicators and you're doing a root cause, you may not be specifically understanding the task at hand, and by using leading indicators or observations in the field, we're seeing that before an injury occurs, suffice to say, before the person may open a cabinet and work live on a piece of equipment or work what they perceive to be live on a piece of equipment, we've actually identified an opportunity within the workforce to identify those critical components. And by including management in that dialogue as part of a leading indicator discussion, we now know that we can effectively control procedures and we can effectively improve training at the front end before incidents occur.
Great, thank you. What trends do you all see while evaluating hazard control practices associated with deficiencies and corrective actions? And are corrective actions addressing the hazard and the risk in order to prevent an undesired outcome?
Could you repeat the first part of that? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bowtie.
So essentially what we're asking here is what trends do you see while we're evaluating hazard control practices associated with deficiencies and corrective actions?
Yes.
So, what I tend to see, and TJ, please feel free to jump in, when after I've made my analysis. But what I tend to see, a lot of it really is driving down to that baseline that I mentioned earlier, which is really the proper documentation and the proper training. So anytime, we're really evaluating any type of hazard controls that are in place, we're really looking at, what level of detail are these specific procedures, whether they be standard operating procedures or whether they be work instructions or things of that nature, and how well are employees actually trained upon those things. You'd be surprised how many organizations we actually interface with that don't have a review in for a procedure, maybe in the past 2 or 3 years. It's really difficult to determine the efficacy of those controls and really how valuable they are to us if they're being really reviewed, periodically, once every 3 years or 4 years. We realize that it's a difficult, it's a challenging thing, but when we tend to audit those processes, we tend to see that those really are major deficiencies when we're actually going through the corrective action process. So what tends to happen is you get a lot of to-dos or little tasks that spurn from those corrective actions, which drives back to your document control process and really what you have in your training process. Do you tend to see different things there, TJ?
No, I agree. I think I would add that the corrective action management process itself, or the CAPA program, however you wish to define it, is an important component there. Looking at specifically closure rates, understanding that we may have high-risk items and we characterize them as such. And if they linger for a lengthy period of time, we may need to better understand why our program is built such that we are unable to close corrective actions in a prompt manner. Or maybe we have so many corrective actions, so many of the same corrective actions, that we're failing to note that those corrective actions may have a common root cause. And the proper answer is to address that common root cause by doing an incident investigation and using appropriate risk management tools.
Excellent. Thank you. When we're talking about developing metrics for EHS reporting, could one of you discuss some leading indicators used to predict performance with the intent to intervene and prevent undesired outcomes?
This is TJ. I think I just mentioned one a moment ago, and that is the corrective action closure rate. Certainly an excellent opportunity to look at how you're identifying and closing observations. Another one is training rate, where individuals are assigned training. Are they taking training? Is training proving effective by passing or failing course rates? In addition, the number of observations. And Fody, you hit on this earlier in your discussion. I think it's important to note that the number of safety observations developed in the field by the workforce typically translates into a reduced number of incidents overall, effectively hosting that I am my brother's keeper mantra, or individuals feel responsible for the safety of themselves and their teammate. Therefore, they are less likely to put themselves or their teammate in a situation of high risk. So again, to briefly answer your question, those three were closure action rates, training rates, and number of observations. So three inherent tools on the leading indicator side.
Yeah, and that's just to piggyback on what TJ was saying. I mean, it's really powerful. The adoption of that BBS or BBO related program within an organization, because again, what we really do tend to see is a paradigm shift and really being accountable for a safe workplace and building that culture out. So that's really a big one for me, as well as the other two items that TJ touched upon.
Great. Along the lines of EHS metrics, are there any, and if so, which ones are they, that correlate with savings?
Could you repeat that last phrase, correlate with?
Sure. Are there any EHS metrics which correlate with savings? And if so, what metrics are those?
That's a good question. I think I would look at it from a perspective of a metric would be the number of first aids, the number of recordables. The lower that number, the less likely you are to incur out-of-pocket expenses for treatments or for lost time. So the inherent cost of a worker being off-site and not productive in their assigned role is an embedded cost attached with an accident. So I think those are, for me, two critical aspects. Fody, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I also, touching upon that concept of lost time, you also have to consider that from an operational perspective. So, Kyle, when you ask that question, it's a little bit difficult to quantify a lot of the times manpower and hours that are given to a specific task. But when we really put an emphasis on risk and grading and really assessing what these low severity, low occurrence related items are, really our decisions from an operational perspective on whether or not to investigate further and really launch that CAPA process for something that may not necessarily need it, really is a saver. So what I would say as another risk or an EH&S related metric would really be, your risk grading. So whether it be, severe, moderate, or unlikely, something of that nature, really is going to, it's going to assist in cost, prevention or cost reduction. How well you'll be able to quantify that is going to be difficult, but from an operational perspective, that's certainly a metric.
Okay, great. We had a question here regarding buy-in. What's your experience regarding getting upper management buy-in for effective hazard control via risk management approach versus the EHS approach? Have you found one to be more effective, and if so, why do you think that's more effective?
This is TJ. From my experience, starting with the quintessential EHS model, setting the foundation for a metrics-driven program, I think what I've found interesting is from a data collection perspective, the EHS program typically wins out. We usually see those metrics are more robust. We usually see that information being collected, parsed, and used to prepare weekly or quarterly metrics or dashboards. I think where we cross the line and enter into a more effective program is by engaging management on the data that's collected on one side of the equation, and then ensure that as we're discussing that data with them and as they see trends, we use that discussion as the launch point or launch pad for engaging leadership in the field. So I would say that, again, in my experience, the quintessential EHS program being data-driven, we pull that data together, and then we oftentimes don't cross the line with management and have them engage in a leadership role to affect change on behalf of the information we collected.
Now, how does that play into buy-in down the chain? So, another way to say is, how do you establish that continuous improvement process program if you might have large portions of the workforce that just don't care about managing risks or hazards in the workplace or identifying these risks and reporting them?
See, Kyle, this is Bowtie here. Just I wanted to comment on that briefly. I think it's really powerful what you just mentioned is, they don't care. And it was interesting. I was at a NAEM conference last month and had the opportunity to speak with a lot of different organizations. And just from the general conversation, you can see that a lot of these different organizations are at different places in regards to what their environmental health and safety related programs are and where they're at. So certainly, really having buy-in with the whole risk-averse process, the zero incident-related programs, this continuous improvement and continuous closed loop, all of these processes, a lot of the times when we're talking about buy-in, a big factor is how far along are they in really having a full environmental health and safety system or set of processes in place. So at least from my experience, that tends to be a big factor.
And I'd like to add just to that briefly.
Sure.
Using the simple risk tools that we've discussed here, understanding why that culture is particularly leaning one way or the other might be helpful. If you look at that from the perspective of an omniscient observer, you might note that there is a penalty for having an unsafe act. So, I am making widgets, and I go ahead and I have a jam in the machine, and I reach in and I pull out a widget, but I don't do it with the appropriate tool, or I don't stop the machine. I might be, quote, penalized for doing that. And I think that culture may have an effect on whether or not the workforce sees safety as a proponent in the workplace or something as an obstacle. So looking at it holistically and taking the approach where we should evaluate even why that's the case, again, using appropriate risk tools, we may actually understand the root cause to be far different than what we thought, and it may not be an apathetic workplace. It may be a system of decisions over a period of time that have led us to this point in the process.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I apologize. There were a few questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, but all of the unanswered questions will be forwarded on to our speakers. Once again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey on your screen to give us your feedback. And that concludes today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank TJ, Bowtie, ETQ, and all of you who listened in. Thank you, and have a great day.